So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm actually a tobacco researcher. We did a little bit of work, though, looking at alcohol, and that's what we'll talk about today. I wanted to thank our funders and my collaborators on these papers. So many people will tell you, right, tobacco and alcohol go together like milk and cookies, or peanut butter and jelly. And if you've ever tried to help someone quit smoking, they'll often tell you that they cannot have a drink. If they have a drink while they're quitting smoking, they'll instantly relapse and start smoking again. So the pairing between tobacco and alcohol is widely regarded as just a natural thing. And I'm going to share with you some research we did looking at how tobacco marketing reinforces the association between smoking and drinking. And we'll share, now that I've seen Laura's talk, right, a tight coupling of tobacco-owned alcohol companies, and then also an example of a more loose coupling with the tobacco industry trying to make alliances with the alcohol industry to move policy. So first, here's tobacco advertising featuring alcohol. So this is actually very common. This is a Camel ad that just, puts together smoking and drinking. We've done content analysis of tobacco advertisements that very frequently do this. You also, previously there weren't actually alcohol-flavored cigarettes, so these are Camel cigarettes flavored as screwdriver or gin. Doesn't sound that palatable to me, but, and then of course when, with the Tobacco Control Act of 2009, brought FDA regulation to tobacco products. Coupled with that was getting rid of fruit, candy, and alcohol-flavored cigarettes. So these are no longer available. So I'm going to share with you one paper that we did, which was looking in the tobacco industry documents with my colleague Nan Zhang. And basically, it was just looking at what was in the industry documents about alcohol. Just curious to know, what do tobacco companies know about pairing drinking and smoking? And if they were doing marketing, how did they go about pairing the two behaviors? So this is an example of an industry document. One thing we found was actually that we just heard about Philip Morris owning General Foods and Kraft Foods. And Philip Morris actually used their consumer database for General Foods and did all these studies looking at the behaviors of drinking Miller beer, smoking cigarettes, and the foods to look for marketing opportunities. And so they conducted a whole bunch of studies looking, and we're able to predict cigarette incidence by looking at the beer consumption in the consumer database. R.J. Reynolds also did similar work with their consumer databases. Stores. That would give you some amount off on cigarettes if you bought a 6-pack of beer. And the idea was, which they lay out really clearly, is that, if you have a consumer who only wanted to purchase 1 pack of cigarettes, you could get them to purchase 2 or 3 so they can get the beer discount. Also, if you had a consumer who only wanted to purchase beer and no cigarettes, maybe the discount would encourage them to buy cigarettes. And so overall, the discount on beer could increase the cigarette consumption. This is also this is a Philip Morris document looking at, again, cross-promoting with their food brands, their Miller beer and Marlboro cigarettes. So they actually did a bunch of consumer testing to see how would people respond if they had these sense-off brands in the same circular for, the Chuck Wagon sale. And in addition to this, they would also do some studies looking at if you could buy Miller beer and have like a Marlboro cents-off coupon attached to it, or conversely, when you bought a carton of Marlboro cigarettes, what if you had a coupon for Miller beer? They did a bunch of consumer tests for this, and actually what they found, so most of the time when we look at the documents, we see how incredibly successful the companies were, but they actually found that this was a little bit risky. And in part of this, when they looked at consumers, most people were not really disturbed by seeing the beer and the cigarettes along with the Kraft Foods, but there were some smokers and non-smokers who kind of had a negative reaction to this, and particularly this was because the negative association with the cigarette brand they were afraid would erode the wholesome identity of particularly the food brands. So because of that, they actually did not do a lot of this overt cross-couponing with the beer, cigarettes, and hot dogs. However, they did continue to do promotions, particularly with tobacco featuring alcohol. In the late 80s and early 90s, as the industry became increasingly scrutinized for marketing to kids, one of the places that the tobacco companies really went into was the bar. This was featured as like an adult-only environment, so you could market however you want. And this is an example of a planning ad from R.J. Reynolds for a Camel-sponsored bar party. And this is in the LA area, and you can see that these bar parties, not only are they fun in adult-only environments, but they also feature drink discounts like $2 shots, $2 beers, and also free beer-soaked hot dogs. So, lovely. So a lot of these activities also had a lot of things like drinking games where you could ride a tricycle and then chug the beer and put it on your head and say, Marlboro is #1. So the kind of fun environment of the bar also increased not just good feelings about the tobacco brands, but also increased alcohol consumption. Cigarette branded alcohol paraphernalia is another example of co-marketing here. So these are just some examples of like the Camel beer koozies and beer mugs and steins. So on the marketing standpoint, which we've heard, just to summarize here, we know that tobacco companies actually understood quite deeply the co-use of alcohol in cigarettes. They used their consumer data to really explore this and develop marketing strategies that reinforce co-use. And then you can also see that many of these adult activities kind of still have this youthful starter appeal. The second part I wanted to talk about a bit was this kind of looser connection, though, in the policy space. So while we were looking at the marketing, we also found some of this stuff looking at policy initiatives. And so we did a second paper, which kind of spun off looking at relationships between alcohol and tobacco industries in terms of public policy. I'm just going to share one of these with you, but one story we have is, in the 80s, this started out with the Tobacco Institute, right, which is a lobbying firm representing the tobacco industry, originally in California, trying to fight a 5 to 10 cent cigarette tax on cigarettes. And they decided to create the Consumer Tax Alliance, which was supposed to be like a broad coalition of industries to fight against taxes. And this was initially the most important industry they decided to reach out to was the alcohol industry. And they expected the alcohol companies to pay like 50% of the CTA's budget, while the tobacco industry would be with, the video games and soft drinks and candy, and each of them paying about 8% of the budget. And basically the alcohol industry, because I guess it's a loose coupling, was not real interested. They were kind of broadly aligned, but not real interested in footing half the bill. So the CTA did not succeed. However, when they thought about the national level, the Tobacco Institute later worked on a new organization called the Consumer Tax Forum, which was more successful. So the Consumer Tax Forum was again designed to oppose excise taxes at the national and state levels. It was framed as a nonprofit corporation that had representatives from all kinds of industries, and was supposed to oppose the kind of general concept of excise taxes, even though really it was created by the Tobacco Institute to fight against cigarette taxes. So here's the list. Gray & Company was their consulting firm. This is a list of firms that they suggested could really have a lead role, and you can see that behind tobacco and the Tobacco Institute, the top 3 are beer, distilled spirits, and wine. And then they also included like trucking and jewelry and oil and sporting goods. And this memo that was written to the president of the Tobacco Institute by the consulting firm really emphasized that the industry which had the greatest opportunity for favorable response was alcohol beverage group. And they also suggested, since alcohol industry is so important to the success of this project, that if people in the tobacco industry contacts new corporate CEOs and other senior level management in the alcohol beverage group, that could be super helpful. So the research we did here also looked at all these different alcohol groups, and we classified them and how interested they were. Basically, everyone was very interested or already working through, discus. So they were quite interested in working in this area. Now, this tobacco tax form, consumer tax form, also didn't do so great. Again, in part because of the payment structure. Again, the Tobacco Institute really wanted the Alcohol Institute to pay more. So finally in 1989, they revived the Consumer Tax Alliance, again, framing it to be a grassroots organization. They now said that it was going to be really labor unions and progressive causes was kind of the branding of it. And they really hid the funding by the Tobacco Institute, the Beer Institute, and the Trucking Association. And they did some national campaigns to oppose excise taxes in general as regressive. And this time, the Tobacco Institute paid 83% of the budget. So it was like the $4 million budget, mostly paid by the Tobacco Institute. And then all the other industries paid the remaining 20% or so. And this was a much more successful coalition. They did a national advertising campaign that was, again, generally about how taxes are bad. And they never showed people smoking, even though they were, they didn't show people smoking and saying that cigarette taxes were bad. They would show people pumping their gas or drinking beer and say that taxes are bad. And this effort, in the 1990s, they felt that this was successful because even though a federal cigarette tax was passed, it was about half the size. It was an 8-cent tax, so it was about half of what they expected. So, in summary, for this policy effort part, you know, there is a history in the documents of coordination for about 20 years. I mean, these documents are now like 40 years old, so it's probably gone on since there. And like other policy arenas, we see that the relationships tended to be more strong and more successful at the national level than at the state or local level. The industries, of course, identified many common areas of interest, not just taxes, which we delved into a bit, but also things like clean indoor air laws, particularly in bars and nightclubs, advertising restrictions, and you know, these themes around creating kind of fake grassroots efforts or astroturf efforts is something we've seen many times, and they complement traditional lobbying. So we're asked to reflect a little bit on solutions or the opportunities here. And I think that, you know, in general, this kind of siloing is a big problem. I love hearing how Laura just gave us a framework to think about these kinds of relationships between industries. And certainly, I think the tobacco folks have kind of seeded the bar too, you know, in terms of, you know, venues, because this argument that a bar is an adult-only environment, so it's okay to market whatever you want, has really then created basically created a situation where, you know, the people who are smoking in the bar are basically really quite far from making an informed adult choice, right? You know, you're kind of drunk, so getting started smoking in that environment really isn't conducive to public health. So thinking more about the common places and channels between tobacco and alcohol, like bars, like convenience stores, as opportunities to really link public health efforts is something I think that's underutilized. Similarly, I think in tobacco now, we actually have very good coalitions that have worked a lot and raised a lot of concerns about flavored products, the increasing potency of nicotine in products, co-opting cultures, targeting with things like menthol. And there are parallel things happening in the alcohol space around, you know, flavored products, ready-to-drink drinks that have, you know, high levels of alcohol in them, co-opting of culture for sales. And I think there's been much less concerns raised in the same way that you get from the tobacco field, and probably is an opportunity for cooperation there. Finally, the other thing that we've seen in looking at some of these documents is that, you know, the tobacco industry has a crappy reputation, and that actually really is a powerful thing, right? The fact that the alliances between tobacco and alcohol were hidden, that people don't really know about tobacco companies owning food companies works for them, allows them to create alliances, and it's very important to keep those things quiet, right? The Marlboro brand would mess up Kraft's image, and similarly, you know, if we can expose the times when the tobacco industry is really behind, you know, these alcohol protestations against taxes, that decreases opportunities for them to create those alliances. And, you know, the alcohol industry doesn't want to be as denormalized as big tobacco, and I think that also creates an opportunity for us. That is exactly 15 minutes, so thanks very much.